So, Sam, Trump said that he's cutting off all talks with Canada because of this digital services tax.
Well, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says trade talks between his country and the U.S. have resumed.
Donald Trump says he is ending trade discussions with Canada and will soon impose a blanket tariff on all this country's products.
President Donald Trump has abruptly terminated all trade talks with Canada, America's second-largest trading partner, because of a seemingly modest 3% digital services tax on tech giants that Canada refused to delay. A direct and blatant attack on our country, Trump declared on Truth Social, promising to announce punishing new tariffs within 7 days. Markets tumbled as $762 billion in annual trade suddenly hung in the balance. This wasn't just about a tax, it was about power, sovereignty, and the future of the digital economy. With $2 billion in retroactive taxes due from American companies like Amazon, Google, and Meta by June 30th, the stakes couldn't be higher. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who months earlier told Trump that Canada is not for sale, now faced an impossible choice: surrender to American pressure or risk economic devastation for a country that sends 80% of its exports south of the border. Behind this dramatic confrontation lies a complex web of global taxation challenges, wounded national pride, and Trump's aggressive negotiating tactics. From the 50% tariffs on Canadian steel to Carney's anti-Trump election platform, this relationship had already weathered storms. But as the tax deadline looms just days away, both nations are locked in a dangerous game of economic brinkmanship that threatens to reshape North American commerce for years to come. What happens when a smaller nation defies the economic superpower next door? Who will blink first in this high-stakes standoff? And could this dispute between longtime allies create dangerous ripples throughout the global economy? It all began with a seemingly modest policy. On June 20th, 2024, Canada enacted its Digital Services Tax Act, creating a 3% levy on revenues earned by large technology companies from Canadian users. The tax applies to tech giants with global revenues exceeding $820 million and Canadian revenues over $14.7 million, a threshold that primarily affects American companies like Amazon, Google, Meta, Uber, and Airbnb. What makes this tax particularly contentious isn't just its existence, but its retroactive nature. Companies would be required to pay taxes on revenues dating all the way back to January 1st. 2022. With the first payments due on June 30th, 2025, US companies were facing an estimated $2 billion bill, a figure that sent shockwaves through corporate America. The Canadian government defended the tax as necessary to ensure digital companies pay their fair share. Traditional businesses with physical presence in Canada have always paid taxes on their operations. But digital giants could operate virtually and avoid similar taxation. This imbalance had long frustrated Canadian officials who viewed the digital tax as simply bringing the tax code into the 21st century. But to the Trump administration, this was nothing short of economic warfare. On June 27th, just days before the first payment deadline, President Trump took to his Truth Social platform with a fiery announcement. Based on this egregious tax, we are hereby terminating all discussions on trade with Canada, effective immediately. We will let Canada know the tariff that they will be paying to do business with the United States of America within the next 7-day period. The markets reacted instantly. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq both turned negative following Trump's post, though they would recover to close at record highs later that day. Meanwhile, the Canadian dollar dropped briefly as investors processed what this might mean for the nation that sends 80% of its exports to the United States. But how did we get from tax policy to trade war in the blink of an eye? The answer lies in the complex relationship that had been unfolding between these two nations in recent months. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, US-Canada relations immediately entered turbulent waters. The president slapped a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy resources, citing concerns about fentanyl production and undocumented migration. These moves sent shockwaves through Canadian industry, with many businesses facing existential threats from the sudden cost increases. The rhetoric grew even more alarming when Trump repeatedly suggested that Canada could become the 51st US state, comments that deeply offended Canadian national pride. When Mark Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, he ran on an explicitly anti-Trump, anti-isolationist platform that resonated with Canadians worried about their sovereignty. But by May 2025, there were signs of thawing relations. Carney visited the White House, where he was reportedly polite but firm with Trump. Though a memorable moment occurred when Carney told Trump that Canada was not for sale, to which Trump ominously replied, "Time will tell." The G7 summit in Alberta on June 16th to 17th seemed to mark a genuine turning point. The two leaders agreed to wrap up a new economic agreement within 30 days, setting a July 21st deadline. Markets rallied on the news, sensing that the trade turbulence might finally be settling down. Even on the morning of June 27th, there were positive signals. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent indicated in television interviews that the administration was open to extending its July 9th deadline for trade deals to Labor Day. If we can ink 10 or 12 of the important 18 trading partners, there are another important 20 relationships. Then I think we could have trade wrapped up by Labor Day, Bessent said optimistically. But behind the scenes, a confrontation was brewing. Canadian Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne had stated the previous week that Ottawa planned to enact the digital tax, even while negotiations with Trump were ongoing. When Canadian officials confirmed they would not delay the June 30th implementation date, Trump's patience apparently snapped. In the Oval Office on June 27th, Trump's rhetoric was uncompromising. "Economically, we have such power over Canada. We'd rather not use it. It's not going to work out well for Canada. They were foolish to do it." When asked if Canada could do anything to restart talks, Trump suggested removing the tax, predicted they would, but then ominously added, "It doesn't matter to me." But while the president projected confidence, the stakes of this confrontation were extraordinarily high for both nations. Before we continue with this high-stakes diplomatic showdown, I want to remind you to smash that like button if you're enjoying this video. Subscribe to the new Diplomat for more in-depth coverage of global affairs that affects your daily life. Your support allows us to keep bringing you these important stories. The numbers tell a startling story about the interdependence between these two North American neighbors. In 2024, total bilateral goods trade exceeded $762 billion, with Canada exporting $412.7 billion and importing $349.4 billion from the US. Canada is America's second largest trading partner after Mexico and the largest buyer of US exports. For Canada, the relationship is even more vital. About 80% of Canadian exports go to the United States. A disruption in this trade flow could have devastating consequences for both economies, but particularly for Canada. The specifics are even more striking. About 60% of US crude oil imports come from Canada, along with 85% of US electricity imports. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the US, and has 34 critical minerals and metals that the Pentagon is eager to obtain. Trump's existing tariffs had already caused significant pain. He had imposed 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as 25% tariffs on autos and auto parts. Goods coming from Canada that weren't compliant with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement faced a combined 50% tariff rate. In response, Canada had levied a 25% tariff on US-made vehicles that weren't compliant with USMCA. They had also retaliated against Trump's initial 25% steel and aluminum tariffs with a 25% tariff on roughly $43 billion worth of US goods, including whiskey, sporting gear, and household appliances. Now, with Trump threatening new, unspecified tariffs within 7 days, both countries were potentially heading toward an even more damaging phase of the trade war. But the dispute wasn't just about economics. It was also about the changing nature of taxation in the digital age. Canada is far from alone in its attempt to tax digital services. Several countries around the world have introduced similar measures in recent years. France was one of the first in 2019, with a 3% levy on revenues from online advertising, digital platforms, and sales of user data. The UK followed with a 2% tax on revenues from social media platforms and search engines. Spain, Italy, and Austria have implemented similar taxes, with rates ranging from 3% to 5%. This global trend reflects a fundamental challenge of the digital economy. How do you fairly tax companies that operate virtually across borders? Traditional tax systems were designed for businesses with physical presence, but digital giants can serve customers in a country without ever establishing offices there. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has been working for years on a global solution to this problem. Canada had actually held off on implementing its digital tax until 2024 to give time for these OECD negotiations. But when progress stalled, Ottawa decided to move forward independently. This global context helps explain why the dispute is about much more than just Canada. The Trump administration has consistently opposed digital services taxes from any country, viewing them as unfairly targeting American companies. A confrontation with Canada could serve as a warning to other nations considering similar measures, particularly in Europe. As White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett bluntly put it on June 27th, they're taxing American companies who don't necessarily even have a presence in Canada. It's almost criminal. They're going to have to remove it, and I think they know that. But the dispute also reflected deeper tensions about economic sovereignty in the digital age. Who has the right to tax digital activities that cross borders? Can smaller countries assert their tax authority against the economic might of the United States? These questions extend far beyond the immediate Canada-U.S. confrontation. The implications were particularly significant for the European Union, which has been at the forefront of regulating and taxing American tech giants. If Canada were forced to back down, it could weaken the EU's position in its own trade negotiations with the Trump administration, which face a crucial July 9th deadline. And as the clock ticked down toward Canada's first tax collection date on June 30th, the pressure was mounting on both sides to find a resolution, or prepare for an escalation. As the dispute intensified, powerful interest groups on both sides mobilized to influence the outcome. In the US, the tech industry threw its weight behind the Trump administration's position. Matt Schruers, chief executive of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, issued a statement applauding the administration's decisive response to Canada's discriminatory tax on US digital exports. On June 11th, 21 US Congress members had sent a letter to President Trump, urging him to pressure Canada to eliminate or pause its digital services tax. If Canada decides to move forward with this unprecedented retroactive tax, it will set a terrible precedent that will have long-lasting impacts on global tax and trade practices, they wrote. Within Canada, business groups were also pushing Carney's government to reconsider. The Business Council of Canada warned that implementing the tax could risk undermining Canada's economic relationship with its most important trading partner. After Trump's announcement, they called on Ottawa to put forward an immediate proposal to eliminate the DST in exchange for the elimination of tariffs from the United States. Rick Tachuk, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada, had criticized the refusal to delay the tax in an opinion piece published just days earlier. It's hard to understand why Ottawa would forego flexibility at such a sensitive moment. But other voices in Canada defended the tax as a matter of national sovereignty and fiscal fairness. These digital services taxes, supporters argued, simply ensure that companies pay taxes where they generate revenue, regardless of their physical presence. Why should Canadian companies pay taxes while foreign digital giants operate tax-free within Canadian borders? Political commentator Tom Mulcair suggested that Trump's dramatic announcement might actually signal that a deal was close, representing a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine breakdown. Meanwhile, Canadian Senator Hassan Youssef, who sits on a Canada-U.S. Trade Advisory Council, told the Globe and Mail that Trump was trying to gain leverage in the talks by putting pressure on Canada. "I think we don't react to it," Youssef advised. This split in Canadian opinion put Prime Minister Carney in a difficult position. Backing down could be seen as surrendering to American pressure, undermining his anti-Trump campaign platform. But standing firm risked severe economic consequences for Canadian workers and businesses. As the world watched this high-stakes standoff unfold, the immediate question became, what happens next? Trump promised to announce new tariffs on Canada within 7 days, by July 4th, ironically America's Independence Day. Treasury Secretary Bessent indicated that U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer would likely open a Section 301 investigation into Canada's digital tax, the same tool used against China during previous trade disputes. Such an investigation would clear the way for tariff retaliation in the amount of harm to U.S. firms, which Bessent estimated at roughly $2 billion. Canada, for its part, had already demonstrated its willingness to retaliate. On the very evening of Trump's announcement, Canada imposed a quota on some steel imports and a 50% surcharge for imports that exceed the quota. Canada's finance minister said the government was acting to protect its industry from unjust U.S. tariffs and warned it remains prepared to take additional steps as needed. The immediate deadline was June 30th, when the first payments of Canada's digital services tax were due. Would U.S. companies comply with the tax demand? Would Canada enforce collection? Each decision point carried the potential to either escalate or diffuse the crisis. Beyond the immediate standoff, there were broader questions about the future of North American trade relations. The USMCA, negotiated during Trump's first term, had provided a framework for regional economic integration. Now that framework was being tested to its limits. The dispute also carried implications for the global economic order. Would other countries be deterred from imposing digital services taxes? Would the OECD negotiations gain new urgency? And could this dispute between allies provide an opening for strategic rivals to exploit divisions within the Western alliance? As we wrap up our analysis of this unfolding trade crisis, the fundamental question remains: who will blink first? Canada faces enormous economic pressure, with 80% of its exports at risk. Prime Minister Carney must weigh his political commitment to standing up to Trump against the potential damage to Canadian workers and businesses. Yet backing down could set a dangerous precedent for Canadian sovereignty in future disputes. For President Trump, the confrontation tests his negotiating strategy of maximum pressure. A quick Canadian capitulation would validate this approach and potentially strengthen his hand in other trade negotiations, particularly with the European Union. But if Canada holds firm and retaliates effectively, it could undermine the credibility of his tactics. The most likely resolution may be a face-saving compromise. Canada could agree to pause or modify its digital services tax while negotiations continue on a broader trade deal. The US could delay or target its tariffs more narrowly to minimize economic disruption. Both sides could point to the OECD negotiations as the proper forum for resolving digital taxation issues. But in the unpredictable world of Trump diplomacy, nothing is certain. The next 7 days will be crucial as both countries decide whether to escalate or de-escalate this dangerous game of economic brinkmanship. What we do know is that the stakes extend far beyond a 3% tax on digital services. This confrontation touches on fundamental questions of economic sovereignty in the digital age, the power dynamics between allies of unequal size, and the rules that will govern international commerce in the years to come. As we monitor this developing situation, one thing is clear. The outcome of this US-Canada standoff will shape North American trade relations for years to come, with ripple effects throughout the global economy. If you found this valuable, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the new Diplomat, and share it with others who care about understanding Trump's tariffs and contemporary US-Canada relations. Your support enables us to continue bringing you the context and analysis behind today's most important global events. See you in our next video that appears on our screen.